Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you guys may be. Welcome to today's webinar, Forecasting Demand in the Face of a Pandemic. My name is Aiden Goldman, and I'll be the moderator today. We will begin shortly, but first, let's go over a few logistics. The webinar will run approximately 45 to 50 minutes, and we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. During the webinar, you can submit questions using the control panel on your screen at any time. And I will be monitoring these questions throughout the webinar and compile a list for Q&A at the end. We will also take questions during the Q&A session itself, but feel free to submit them during the webinar session using the control panel on your screen. We will try to address as many questions as possible, but if we do not get to your questions, you will receive a follow-up email after the conclusion of the webinar. We are also recording this webinar and will email you a link to the video sometime next week. In addition, the webinar video will be posted to our website where you can find a full archive of past webinars. They are free and a great way to catch up on any past webinars you may have missed. Now I'll turn it over to James Berry, Director of Training here at Business Forecast Systems, to begin the webinar, Forecasting Demand in the Face of the Pandemic.
Thank you, Aiden. I'm here with my colleague, Sarah, as well. So Sarah, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Sarah Darin. At BFS, I really focus on kind of product development and methodology. So helping people understand the methodology, making sure that the best methodology is being implemented in the product and things like that. My longer background is primarily in statistical consulting. So a lot of customized models, forecasting models, regression analysis, predictive analytics, worked with a lot of different companies. My formal training really is in applied math and statistics. And back to James.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So I am James Berry. I am the Director of Training here at Business Forecast Systems. I've been with the company for a while now, so over 17 years, and just like Sarah, I've had a lot of experience working with a lot of folks, especially recently in the last few months, gathering a lot of good, useful information, talking to our customers who have helped us actually with this webinar and this very topic because it is affecting everybody. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, we are going to talk about the impact that COVID-19 has had on everybody's business. One of the things that's been interesting, and we will try to touch upon, is that the impact has been very different for different types of companies, for different people. It really is having, some people have been greatly affected, others not, and in the ways that people have been affected is really different depending upon who you talk to and how that works. So we're going to try to touch upon some of that. And one of the key things that has really emerged as we've been helping people in their forecasting process is that there really are these different phases of the pandemic. Some people are still in the middle of being impacted by it and that their data is still very much in flux. However, others have really established what we call a new normal, where basically they had an impact from COVID-19, but they're really starting to return back to normal and establishing a new pattern or a new sort of business sort of things going forward. And so really depending upon where you are in this phases actually really dictates the methodologies that you'll need to use. And so one of the things we will try to touch upon today is where are we in our phase, and where are we going to, how are we going to deal with that depending upon the phase that we are in. And as Aiden mentioned, after this, we will have a Q&A. We're hopefully going to get quite a few. Some folks have already submitted questions, but please, throughout the seminar itself, please continue to submit them. We will try to answer as many as possible as we go. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is really just the process that people were going pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, how it was working. And because we're going to talk about how it's impacted your business and how we're going to want to deal with that in the forecast going forward. However, of course, we need to sort of establish what it was like before we were being impacted by this. So our standard process for a lot of our customers is, during each forecasting cycle, they're going to gather up their data and they're going to generate a baseline statistical forecast. Okay, so we're going to use our past historical patterns that we see, and we're going to use that to generate a baseline. We're going to review that statistical forecast, hopefully making any kind of model changes or things like that where necessary. We would then gather business intelligence and bring that business intelligence to overlay on top of that initial statistical forecast that you would produce. And using all of these changes, we would come to a final consensus and export that forecast out. What we're going to look at really are the two pieces there where you're making statistical adjustments in business intelligence. That has really become super important now that the patterns are changing and we're needing to deal with these different patterns, and our historical data might not be as stable and a reliable factor going forward. Okay. With that, I will have Sarah touch base with some folks. Go ahead.
Okay, so what we want to talk a little bit about now is how the pandemic has impacted your process. And the way that the pandemic has had its impact really varies across businesses. So some have really benefited and seen their sales boom, while others have really seen their sales plummet. And similarly, some have stabilized while others have not. And actually, what we'd like to do right now, before taking a look at some examples, is a quick poll that you should be able to see here. So quickly let us know how your business has been affected by COVID-19. And I'm seeing some responses come in. Let me just wait. We're right now at 67% have voted. And right now, the winner, the leader in this poll thus far is 42% negatively. We have 37% both, 17% positively, and it's pretty much steady at that, and 3% neither. So definitely, predominantly negative, and that's not too surprising. But it is interesting that, it actually has had a positive impact on 17% of businesses. My guess is that in terms of the forecasting process, it hasn't had a positive impact on anybody's ability to forecast. But to just take a look at an overview of how US businesses have been impacted across the board, let's actually take a quick look at some data in Forecast Pro. So what we're going to be looking at here is US retail sales. And when we highlight it first here, we're looking at US retail sales for the past 15 years or so. You can see it's extremely seasonal. And so when you're looking for these kind of the impact of the pandemic, which you can actually see right here, it's actually easier to see if you look at the seasonally adjusted. So if we look at total retail sales, so this is across all businesses, you definitely see in April 2020 a really big dip. So in terms of retail, on average, retail took a big hit, but in that month. And actually after that April 2020, we've actually seen a pretty significant increase in retail sales. But as we look at the different businesses that make up that number, there's a lot of variability in how businesses have done. So if we look at something like grocery stores, you can see actually in April 2020, there was a big increase as people were stockpiling, and then it's actually leveled out at a much higher level than it was pre-COVID, as people aren't going out to eat that as much, and that means that they need more groceries to make dinner. Some of the other things that you might want to look at, you have health and personal care. Health and personal care did see this big dip, but then after that, this is kind of following the same trend that they were seeing before, so not a lot of big impacts. Another thing that's interesting to look at, for me at least, is building materials and garden equipment. As people are staying at home now, this is something else that actually has really benefited positively. People are much more focused on making their home a pleasant place to be. They're investing a lot of money in home improvements. And then, finally, as we look down here a little further at some of these other things, obviously something like food services and drinking places. You see a particularly big hit in April as lots of places were simply shut down. And in terms of leveling out, it continues to be much lower than it was pre-pandemic. The other thing that I kind of find interesting is the clothing one. This actually looks pretty similar to the restaurants, with it leveling out at a much lower point. But this also speaks to the fact that people are working at home, and what they wear just doesn't matter as much as it used to. So in addition to like seeing a lot of variability across the different businesses that make up retail sales, you also see a lot of differences across different geographies. So we're going to take a quick look at another data set. And this data set actually, it's real estate data. So it is, nope, that's not quite right. But once we get there, it is data that is actually publicly available on Redfin, and they call this their COVID-19 data. And basically, this is pending sales for homes. And when you look at the total U.S. numbers, you can see, over time, it's very seasonal. The first 3 years here are very consistent. As we go into 2020, obviously, you see this big dip here. And starting, this is weekly data, so this is going to be following right around like end of March, beginning of April, followed by coming up here. But if you start looking into the different geographies, the impact played out very differently across the different geographies. So if I look at a place like Alaska, you still see that very consistent first 3 years, but then you see this big increase as Alaska suddenly became a much more appealing place to settle in. And you actually see something very similar if you look at a place like Vermont. So Vermont, again, lots of open space, much more appealing to move to a place like Vermont all of a sudden. Then if you look at some of the places that were really hard hit by the pandemic, so I'm going to go down to New York, where of course it first came out, pandemic first hit New York the hardest. And you can definitely see a much stronger dip happening right at the start of the pandemic. And since then it started to rebound. There are a couple of theories about why it might rebound. It could be simply shifted demand, so that people weren't looking at homes here, and now they're going to buy homes. It also might have something to do with, and this is what I tend to think, with people wanting to move out of the city into the suburbs and get more space. And that certainly we're coming out of the Boston area, and that certainly is a trend that we're seeing in the Boston area. And then finally, there are a lot of places where you just don't see much of an impact. So if you look at a place like Kansas, at least in the beginning here, the sales look actually pretty consistent with the first 3 years. Then Kansas actually started seeing a little bit more of an impact of COVID, and you see sales falling off a bit. Georgia is another good example of you don't see a really big impact. So across the geographies, you're going to see different rollouts. And that's also going to certainly be applicable to across different countries and things like that. So in terms of forecasting, if you're forecasting across different geographies, it might be important to understand how the pandemic has impacted geographies differently. So let's go back to the slides. And most of the remaining points here really kind of summarize some of the stuff I was just talking about previously. That some businesses are seeing demand not shifting, so necessities, the personal care that we looked at. A lot of businesses are seeing a very positive impact, and possibly a new normal, like home improvement sales. They might be higher for the near future. Impacts have varied across the geographies. Now, the final thing here, though, we didn't really talk about too much, but is really important. It was one of the things that James will be focusing a lot. But businesses are really being plagued by stockouts and longer lead times. You don't see that impact in our kind of high-level data that we're showing you, but that for an individual business, that has been a really big issue. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to James to talk about that.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So as Sarah mentioned, how is this affecting the kind of customers that we're working with here in Forecast Pro? All right, so what are our customers telling us? And these are some of the things we're going to try to illustrate throughout the rest of this webinar. The first is that we have seen a large percentage of our customers are really establishing a new normal, that they had several months of impact, in the spring and in through the summer, but recently, in the last 2 months or 3 months, they've actually started to establish this new normal. Now, for some people, that's returning back to a pre-COVID level of sales. For others, it is either it's leveling off at either a slightly lower or a slightly higher level of sales that they think will continue. Okay, so we have seen a large subset of folks who are having that new normal scenario, and we're going to try to illustrate that. The other thing we're seeing is this continued unstable demand, and that can be caused by a lot of things. One of the big things that's actually coming out of talking to our customers is that folks who deal with big box or e-commerce are really seeing these large kind of spikes that Sarah just mentioned with this kind of stock out issue, where basically the people had shut down for a month, and then as soon as they came back online, these big box or big customers basically wiped them out again, placed these very large orders to resupply to make up for these stock outs that they've been having, these back orders that they've been having, and then they stock out again. And they're on this kind of roller coaster of this up and down demand, where as soon as they get any capacity to come back, they're having these massive orders come in to try to fill back orders, and then they're stocking out again. So this is something we're seeing a lot of, and we're going to try to illustrate that as well. The other thing we are seeing is that the big question people get to us is, okay, well, we don't want to use all of the past 6 months worth of information in our forecasting process going forward. We don't think that whatever happened for the last 6 months is going to happen the next 6 months or the 6 months after that. We think it will be different. It could be normal, it could be a new establishment, but how do we say, look, we want to ignore, not just ignore, but we want to compensate for these specific months that are happening, and we want to improve our forecasting process based off of this. And then the final thing, and I'm starting to hear this a lot, I've been hearing it through all of October, is everybody has really been laser focused on just finishing out 2020. Most folks who use Forecast Pro forecast out 1 to 2 years into the future, but everybody I've been talking to in the last few weeks have just been like, look, we want to get our forecast out to the end of the year. In 2021, everybody is sort of seeing as a reset. Whether that's realistic or not, that's just sort of the sentiment that we're getting from a lot of our customers. It's, look, let's just finish out this year. Let's just get the next couple of months in, and then let's try to move on from there. So that's been kind of the things that we're seeing. And these are kind of the kind of anecdotes that we're getting feedback from our customers who've been sharing with us their data and have been asking us questions of how to handle their forecasting process. These are kind of the big bullet points that we've been seeing with some folks. Now, with that said, what we want to do is we want to show you some examples of what we've been doing. Now, the key thing here that I mentioned earlier is that we are really trying to categorize your data into phases, and the strategies that you would use to forecast really depend on the phase that you are in. Now, in the beginning, we actually had done a webinar back in April because we were being inundated with customers who were saying, look, our data is really, really different. We're being affected by this. We don't know what to do. And that was really the beginning. You didn't have any pre-existing data to handle this. We didn't have any experience of what we were seeing. Some people shut down completely, so their entire business shut down, the production shut down. Other people saw these huge, as we saw with, as Sarah showed with some of the retail sales, really this big, huge explosive growth all of a sudden, like out of nowhere, that they didn't expect, and they didn't know what to see going forward. So they didn't have really any data, they didn't have any warning, and they didn't know what to do. Now what we're finding people are in the middle or in the end. So we're now moving into a new phase. So if we're still in the middle of this, what we're doing is we're experiencing wild sales swings. Okay, we're still having supply chain issues. We're having large lead times. We're having large orders being placed by our customers. And this is really throwing off our data. We're really still on what I call the roller coaster. You know, our data is going up and down. It's not, you know, what happened last month is not an indication of what's going to happen next month. We have a lot of back orders coming in. We have these issues with our supply chain. And this is going to be something that's going to require a lot of intervention still on your part, where the statistical modeling is not really going to work perfectly. It's going to require a lot of input on your side. Now, the other thing we're seeing is folks who are reaching the end of this, that in the last 2 months with August and September data, now October is finishing up, their businesses have started to stabilize. They had a large impact in March, April, May, and June, but starting in the summer and now going into the fall, they're starting to see their business stabilize and establish this new normal that we're coming into it. Now, in this case, we can actually start using the data. Now that we have August, September, and then next week we'll have October's, and if you were using weekly data, you'll now have 10 or 12 weeks of stability. We can start using that, leveraging that data that's already come in to start establishing where we're going to be going forward. And that can mean just modeling that the past our events. It can also be putting more weight onto the recent data to make sure that our information is being weighted heavily. And so really, depending upon which situation you're in, the middle or the end, there are different strategies. Now we're going to look at an example of each of these, but before we do, we have one more poll we would like folks to participate in, which is really, where are you in this forecasting cycle? Are you still in the beginning? I hope not. Are you in the middle, the end, or are you unaffected? So please fill out the poll. We'll let give everybody a few minutes to answer. Looks like so far the middle is winning quite a bit, which is not unexpected. That's kind of what we're hearing from folks. Coming in, let's see, going in. All right, so 80% of you have voted. Okay, here we go. And by a landslide, it is the middle. So still at the beginning is 5%, the middle is 69%, the vast majority. And at the end, where we're actually seeing some light at the tunnel, is 26%. Again, that's the kind of thing that we are seeing with our customers, is that some folks are really establishing the new normal, other folks are still in the middle. Now, because we like to do things out of order, we're going to start with the end scenario. Okay, just because it's kind of the cleanest to show, and then we will look at the middle scenario, which seems to be where everybody is. So again, in this scenario, we have a major impact in the spring, businesses start to rebound in the summer, and we're entering end of the year where business is stabilizing. So what we would see in an example like this, where we would have data coming in, you can see here in the springtime, March, April, and May, we were affected, potentially shut down, had huge drop in demand. Throughout the summer in June, July, we started to recover. And then in August and September, we've started to establish this new normal that we think will continue at least in the short term. And so we want to go ahead and take a look at this. So we have an example from one of our customers. This is an example of a clothing company that has come in. You can see I have simplified this quite a bit. They have this shirt and they have different sizes with different colors. So we can have a small and black and blue. We can see these mediums, and you can see one of the things that's interesting about this data is that they are affected. So this is real data, it comes from one of our customers, and it really does illustrate that different items are affected differently. This one had this kind of precipitous drop, whereas this one is not as affected going forward. And you'll see this with your data, that there'll be differences. You know, here they had a drop, they had a rebound and a drop. And so we have these kinds of ways of dealing with this. Now, what you will also see, of course, is that Forecast Pro is completely guessing. It's at the moment, it's just taking some sort of average. So how is it that we want to approach something like this, where we feel like we have started to establish a new normal and we want to go forward? For this, we're going to focus primarily initially on the event models. Now, one of the things that will happen is the models themselves do weight the more recent data more heavily. And so after you have a few months of this, the models will start emerging. But if you want to have some ability to basically control what the narrative will look like, again, this kind of thing that keeps coming up over and over again is, I just want to finish out the year, I want to continue to use my judgment, then you can do that using our event functionality. Now, what I have done is I've actually created 3 event schedules to try to deal with what we're seeing here, okay? So basically, we have our new normal scenario, where March through July were affected, but August and September are our new normal, okay? What we can also do is we can say, and then what that's going to do is that new normal is going to continue out for the entire forecast period. That's our year going forward. Now, I have another scenario where I think actually I have a return to normal, so that March through September, up to where we are, has been affected. But starting in October, this growth is going to continue and we're going to grow back up here and back to where we were starting in October. Or I have scenario number 3, where I'm going to have my new normal, which we've established here in August and September, will continue through the rest of the year, but then we'll return to our pre-pandemic levels starting in 2021. And so I've created these 3 event schedules that will allow me to do that. And what I want to do is sort of show the different scenarios that we can use. So if I say this is our new normal and we're going to be at this new normal from now on, I can choose this scenario. And what I've done is I've basically said that in March, April, May, June, and July, these were special events. But I let the program use the data in August and September saying this is it. And the program will put more weight on the recent data. And you can see we're continuing our old pattern, but at this lower reduced service level, Okay, so that's one potential scenario, and we can set this up. Now, what we could also do is we could say, no, actually, I think we're going to be at this new normal level for the rest of the year, but then starting in 2021, we're going to grow back up into our higher level. So I would pick a different scenario where I'm going to say I'm going to new normal just for the rest of 2020. And in that case, when I could do this scenario, we stay low for the rest of the year, but we're jumping back up in 2021. We've heard this a lot from customers, that this idea that, look, we just need to finish out the year. Again, I keep saying it over and over again because I keep hearing it over and over again. It's that we need to finish out the year, and then we think we're going to return to normal after that. Or we can have scenario number 3, which is that actually, no, we're going to return to the new normal starting in October. So we're going to basically bring up, if we come up here for new normal here, we're going to return to the pre-COVID levels up here. And really, one of the big things that's happening now as we're establishing this and as we're reaching towards, where we're still reaching towards the end of this, is that what do we believe will happen? So we still need our business intelligence to come to play, but we can start relying more heavily on statistical methods to help us get to that point, so that I can actually say, you know what, especially if I think that we have established this new normal. So if I go back to my first scenario here going forward, I have basically marked these as special points, but I'm going to start using my data going forward. I'm going to start using expert selection methodologies to use statistical-based methodologies moving forward. So I don't have to rely so heavily on my judgment, okay? Now, that being said, if we're going to go back into, if we're still in the middle of it, which a lot of you are talking about, and that's obviously, the poll indicated that, we're still going to have to rely more heavily on our judgment in this case, okay? So again, the middle scenarios, there was a major impact in the spring, the business came back online, but you could have had back orders, you could have had stockouts, you could have had lead time issues. These are going to continue, and this cycle keeps repeating. We're on this kind of roller coaster. So if we look at an example like this, again, in the beginning, we dropped down because we were being affected. We started having our mild recovery. We then ended up being wiped out as we fill our back orders and make up for missed supply. This, of course, leads to another shortage. And then we need to have a recovery, and then we, again, need to fill back orders. And we get into this kind of repetitive cycle of going over and over again. And the question is this back order going to be enough and we're going to establish a normal going forward? Are we going to continue up and down like this? It's going to require a lot more of your intervention to make this work. So to look at this, we have an example here. These are our electronics. So what you can see here, this is from one of our electronic distribution companies, and they're selling to a big box. So they're selling through e-commerce, and this is a problem. And so we need to figure this out. They have an issue here where they were actually fairly well established. They had a shortage and then had to make up for it. And one of the things we're seeing is that, of course, the model continues this into the future. And so what we need to do is we need to figure out, what are we going to do with this? Now, one thing we could do is we can say that, actually, I'm going to come in, I created a scenario for this, which we'll go and apply, where actually we think this big back order fill is going to stock us out again, and we're going to have to do it again the month after. We're going to stock out, and then we'll establish a new normal. So again, we're using our judgment to say, this is what we think will happen going forward. So I'm actually needing to intervene. I'm needing to tell the program, I can't rely on the statistical modeling. I need to come in here and put in this information. We can see another one here where it's already had the stock out, the back, the stock out again, and again, it's continuing. I can't rely on the statistical. I need to start judging what I think will happen. So I can put on a specific event here saying, yeah, I think we're going to keep this roller coaster going, and then we're just going to have to average out starting in 2021. I don't know what will happen here. Now, in this case, what I've been doing is saying, these patterns will repeat themselves the same way again, which is that we're going to capture this. The other thing that we can start doing is using more judgment. That could be entering overrides where you actually set the level, or you can start coming in where you can actually start seeing some of this information and setting your own pattern. So for instance, if I were to create a pattern like this is very similar to what Sarah showed in the beginning with the retail sales, where there was a spike in the beginning, but now we're continuing up at this spike going forward. And what I could do is I could, of course, put this on to any of my different items. Here's one where it's been growing just like we saw there. And what I could do is I could put this on as a weight. If we come over here and I go ahead and put this on my weight, we put this June spike here. And you can see I can continue that kind of roller coaster pattern. That's where I'm actually going to come in. Now, I could have done that with weighting. I could have done that with manual overrides. But in either case, I'm using my judgment to say what I think will happen. And I can't rely on the statistical methods to start taking over, because I think I'm still in the middle of this. I need judgment, whether that's through events, whether that's through weights, whether that's through overrides. Those are going to be really important decisions. So again, the key things here is, am I going to be relying solely on my judgment, or can I start using some more modeling-based approaches now that I have established myself a new normal? And it's really going to be dependent on your data. Now, a lot of these techniques that we're showing, the good part about the sort of event modeling or the weighting transformation is they can be applied on a mass scale. So for a large group of items, for an entire division, things like that, they can be applied, as opposed to actually going in and overriding manually on an item by item basis. And so there are these strategies that we need to start employing of how do we start taking an assessment of where we are now as a business, and can our data tell us something going forward, or are we still going to be requiring a lot of judgment in that? Okay. And with that, there is always a third approach, and we're going to pass that on to Sarah, who's going to discuss our regression approach as well.
Thank you, James. So dynamic regression is something else that can be used as a strategy for forecasting in the midst of this pandemic here. And it's also something that we have heard a lot more interest from our customers about how they might be able to leverage regression in this situation. So first of all, dynamic regression, very complicated. Typically, you're taking a whole course in it. Sometimes we'll give a whole webinar on it. Here we have 15 minutes. That said, we're going to give a very quick explanation of what we mean by it. So a dynamic regression is something that allows for the introduction of explanatory variables. What is an explanatory variable? It's a sales driver. It's something that when you see ups and downs in a sales driver, you see ups or downs in your own demand. So good examples of a good example of a explanatory variable might be weather and how it impacts electricity sales. So when it gets really hot outside, people turn on their air conditioners, you expect to see an increase in electricity. So there's some type of possibly causal relationship there. Within dynamic regression, you can also do things like account for stockouts, demand surges, and some of those early spikes or dips. So it actually has a lot of the same functionality that you actually see with those event models, albeit in maybe a slightly more complicated situation. But the real power of dynamic regression is that it allows you to include what we would call continuous data. So variables that actually have different values for each period that you might have. So things like the COVID-19 case or deaths. And this is something that actually the data is available for you to download from the University of Washington IHIME data set. So that actually is the project that it informs the forecast that the U.S. government uses in terms of the overall death projection. So back in the spring when we heard that there would be 200,000 deaths by the end of this year, that was coming from this IHIME data, and that again is publicly available, and you can actually use it in regression models potentially if there is an impact there. There's also things like Google mobility metrics. So Google provides data on how people's behaviors and movement have changed since the pandemic. So from a baseline, they will look at things like how much people are going to, say, grocery stores relative to pre-pandemic, how much people are going to things like parks and recreation, how much time people are spending at home, how much time people are spending in the workplace. So it's data that helps you understand what the impact has been on individual behavior. And of course, there's always, dynamic regression is always an important thing for if you have an important economic impact. So if your business is very driven by the economy, incorporating things like unemployment, which obviously has increased significantly in the U.S. and probably most other countries, that might be an important thing for your sales forecast as well. The one issue, we're not pointing it out right here, is when you use dynamic regression, what you actually have to do is you have to provide a forecast for your explanatory variables in order to generate a forecast for your actual own demand. And that can be an issue because it might be hard to really know what is going to happen with, say, unemployment into 2021 or the number of cases and deaths. And this is one of the issues with regression in general, yet it also means that scenario planning, and scenario planning, very similar to what James was just showing, can be very useful. So the idea of scenario planning is that in the face of uncertainty, in the face of not really understanding what is going to be happening with the forecast of your explanatory variables, creating and communicating different forecasts based on different forecasts of your explanatory variables can be useful. And this really does come down to something like generating a best case scenario, a middle of the ground scenario, and then perhaps a worst case scenario. And this can also help in the review process because once you set up the scenarios, the assumptions of the scenarios are very clear, and it might help you understand and kind of choosing where between those scenarios you might be following. So with that, let's actually go and take a look at how we can do dynamic regression in Forecast Pro. So what we're looking at here is a very simple project, a single SKU project, and what this is monthly sales of pet food. And what you can see is in the beginning here, you see a little bit upward trend, no real seasonality, which kind of makes a lot of sense since it's pet food, and pets pretty much eat the same amount each month, so you don't expect it to be seasonal. But as you get towards the end of the data here, you definitely can see a pretty big impact of the pandemic. So starting in March, you see some stockpiling starting to happen. April, you see an all-time high in monthly sales. And after that, you see sales coming down to a little bit of a new normal here. So it's kind of like stabilizing with a little bit of a zigzag pattern, but it is at a lower level than what it was pre-pandemic. So first of all, what would happen if we just go ahead and use automatic forecasting in an extrapolative type of method? And I believe this is probably exponential smoothing that we're choosing through our expert selection here. But what you can see is that the forecast using this extrapolative method is pretty much saying that what happened this year, what happened in 2020, is what you can expect to happen in the next year going into 2021. And it really makes absolutely no sense. It's a very seasonal forecast that we see here for what we know is not a seasonal item. So this is not the forecast that we want. So instead, what we want to do here is we're going to look at dynamic regression as a way of accounting for this. So I'm going to go to my dynamic regression manager here, and there are a couple of things happening here that we want to account for. The first is there was this stockpiling that happened in April, and then there was an impact of people going to the grocery store perhaps less often. So those are the two things that I want to think about here. And in terms of the that spike that happened, there was basically 1 month, maybe a little bit in March too, but there was 1 month where there was this big kind of panic surge in demand as people wanted to make sure that their pets were going to be fed through the summer. And while you could use an event and an event schedule to account for this type of spike, in dynamic regression, you can use a spike to account for it. And a spike is something that you don't need to read into Forecast Pro. You can create on the fly and using this spike system variable. So I'm going to say that I want to have a spike in demand in April 2020 here, and I add that to the model. And I also want to understand how the decrease in grocery mobility, people going to the grocery store less, has had an impact on my demand for dog food. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on this and add that to the model as well. So I'm going to hit OK. And now actually I'm going to go to my forecast view so I can really understand what this looks like. So I'm going to go, I have the setup, layout here. And what you can see, and actually I'm very quickly going to go back to the model before. You can see, first of all, in this forecast view, we have fitted values as well as the forecast. Not too surprisingly, that exponential smoothing model, I believe it's an exponential smoothing model that we have here. Yes, it is not fitting well either historically, and as we talked about, the forecast looks a little odd. So now I'm going to go back to the regression, which, okay, we already have this set up here, so, okay, 5 here. Okay, so applying that regression again, let's go down and look at some of the numbers that we have here. So again, there are a lot of numbers here. We really don't have the time to fully assess everything that's going on. But the main thing, as you can see in red here, marked regressors are insignificant. So anything red means it's not an important sales driver of dog food demand, which means that grocery mobility and this surge of demand in April were both important variables. And in particular, if we wanted to look at this coefficient here of 4,452, what does that mean? What that means is for each percentage increase in grocery store mobility relative to pre-pandemic levels, you're actually seeing an increase of 4,452 dog food unit sales. And it also means that if you lose a point of grocery store activity, then you're actually losing that same amount of sales. But as we go down here, we didn't really look at the MAD and the MAKE prior, but the MAD and the MAKE look pretty reasonable. So in this case, it does seem that that this is going to be a pretty good model for us going forward. So what about scenario planning around this? So when I set up this model, I included, and actually we can go and take a look at this quickly. We set this model. This is what our grocery store mobility looks like. So you have this big drop in grocery store mobility and then evening out right around here at these kind of lower than, around 5% lower than levels. And we included a scenario for it in terms of it increasing a little bit. And this is kind of a medium of the road scenario. So what we want to do now is take a look at a couple of different scenarios. And I have that in a different project here. Nope, not the pots and pans. That's okay. Oh, it is. I'm sorry. Yeah, you were right. Okay, so what we've done here is each of these SKUs is different. So if we look at the data manager, what I've added in is I've added in some additional data that allows me to do this scenario. And if I go to the historic view, historic data view quickly here, what you can also see is each of these SKUs has the exact same historic data in it. And I've also read in 3 different scenarios for the grocery mobility. So this first one is what we saw in the other projects. It's kind of the medium, middle of the road scenario. And then we have also a good scenario and a bad scenario. And in terms of looking at those scenarios, let's actually take a quick look at a multi-graph item, and that has more than I need on it. Yeah. If we look at these 3 scenarios here, you can see that during the historic demand period, they're all the same. And then we have the kind of more optimistic in terms of grocery store mobility evening out at pre-pandemic levels, the red one that we have here, and then the kind of grocery mobility being still pretty low. So in terms of generating different forecasts for those scenarios, we can do that by, for each of these, I'm going to go to the forecast view again. I can build apply that regression that we built already to each of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the manager here, and I'm going to build the same regression that we had before. And so with the April, but I'm going to use this other scenario variable. So this is going to be the best one. And you can see that using that basis, we have this scenario here. And now I'm going to go and I'm going to build this for the worst one again. And actually, this time I'm going to start from the previous one. Okay. So what we're going to do now is I'm actually going to save this as in practice. It is definitely good to actually name these regressions appropriately, so you remember exactly what they're doing. And for this worse, I'm going to actually remove this variable. I'm going to, and add in this worst one here. And I'm going to have to go back and change the good one too. So I'm going to say, okay, you can see that. And that's right. And that's right. Okay. So we have our different scenarios here. And now I can actually look at how these different scenarios are playing out in terms of our demand forecast. So up here we have our best, here we have our medium, and here we have our worst scenario. So dynamic regression can be very helpful for comparing those different scenarios and for planning out those different scenarios. So let's go back to the slides actually. Okay, so one of the things that is really important is, while dynamic regression can be very helpful in modeling situations like this, it really does complicate your forecasting process a whole lot. So before just jumping into it as this is how I'm going to do things, think carefully and make sure that the variables, that it's really important that you're getting much more accurate forecasts using dynamic regression than you might using, say, event models or weight variables or things like that. Across this entire process, in terms of the gathering and updating data, you just simply have more data that you need to be generating and collecting, because you now have this whole explanatory variable history that you also need to manage, potentially go and download things from Google and stuff like that, and that's going to take a lot of time. In terms of the review part of it, because it's more complicated, the actual review of the models that you are automatically updating, you might run into more issues from a statistical standpoint. And then in terms of this kind of business intelligence and override stage, a lot of that is going to be discussing the different scenarios and really planning around those different scenarios. And even then, you might still have to do overrides as well. So it's, in a way, adding an additional phase to this business intelligence stage in terms of you have to generate these different scenarios as well as manage the override process as well. That said, the scenario planning is pretty structured. So in the end, hopefully, there's been enough discussion that that consensus is pretty achievable. So with that, we're going to quickly summarize and then have time for a few questions. So
with COVID-19, it has impacted just about everything that we're doing. We saw that when we polled everybody, most people are being affected by this in one way or another. I know these have been brief, but obviously, the where you are in the process, the impact of all of this really does have different sort of approaches that you would be taking in terms of generating a forecast. Okay.
So another thing that you want to think about is that now that you do have all this, that you have 6 or more months of a post-pandemic data, that at least things are a little bit easier. So at the beginning of this pandemic, it really was difficult to use, the March and April data at all. Now it's easier to use these statistical adjustments to generate reasonable forecasts.
Oops, went a little too far. There we go. As I mentioned quite a bit, there are really these different phases that we're in. Are we in the middle of it still, or are we finishing the end and have this new normal? So can we rely on our historical data going forward, or do we need to do much more judgmental based adjustments in order to generate an accurate forecast? And that's really an important one for us to go through.
And as we just discussed, dynamic regression can really be very useful in helping quantify how the pandemic has impacted your business, and it can be really useful for scenario planning. But again, think carefully before you jump into dynamic regression modeling. It can be pretty complicated. Okay, and with that, as a reminder, as Aidan told us at the beginning, this recording of today's webinar will be posted next week on forecastpro.com. And when you take a look at that, you'll notice that we also have all of our previously presented webinars available there as well. We encourage you to take a look. There's a lot of really good information there. When the webinar does become available, you will be receiving an email to let you know. Okay, and if you also visit our Forecast Pro page, you'll see that we have a number of events. The next event that we have coming up is our methodology seminar, basically. So this is a workshop on best practices and application of business forecasting techniques using Forecast Pro. And it's a methodology involved thing. We also We've been running these on a pretty regular basis. After November, we'll be having another one in February. We also, and this isn't listed in the slides here, we have a user conference coming up, hopefully. Right now we're planning on it. We'll see if it ends up happening, but we're planning on doing that in, I believe it's the end of September of 2021. So keep that on your radar as well. If you do register, and need to pull out, we will offer refunds up to just a couple weeks in advance, I believe. And of course, as I think all of you know, we are the makers of Forecast Pro software. All of the examples that you saw today use Forecast Pro. And if you're interested, reach out and let us know, and we'll help you out. And finally, other learning material you can find on youtube.com. So with that, let's actually get into the questions and answers. So one question that was submitted yesterday, actually, which was a really interesting question, I thought, had to do with whether using custom allocation is going to be helpful for managing the pandemic forecasting process. So as a little bit of background, actually, can we go to yes, it is the Redfin data quickly. Okay, I'm actually going to go to New York quickly. Since I got this question yesterday, I was able to set up a quick little example here. So I'm actually going to add in forecast very quickly here. And I also previously set up a regression here called admission. So this is a regression that uses basically hospital admissions in New York to forecast sales, home sales in New York. So you'll notice when I put that on here, we didn't actually see anything happen. And the reason for that is because by default, what Forecast Pro is doing is it's actually forecasting at this county level and aggregating those up to generate the New York forecast. And that's something that we don't want to do right now. Instead, what we actually want to do is use the actual forecast from New York, from the statistical model, this regression model for New York, create it at that level, and then push it down to the lower level. Typically, most people are doing that through top down. And when we do top down, the way that we're pushing that forecast down is according to the distribution of the forecast across the subgroup, in this case, the counties. And that means that we are using top-down modeling. The forecasts for the level below are actually being leveraged, which means that it matters what these forecasts are, and it's something that you actually have to manage and pay attention to. As an alternative, there's something that is called custom allocation. Custom allocation, instead of using those perhaps unreliable forecasts at the lower level, allocates this New York forecast, this higher level forecast, according to a known distribution. And when you do that, that means that you don't need to be managing basically all of these lower level forecasts. You can just push it down according to something that you know and expect to happen. And we usually recommend this when things aren't changing a whole lot over time, and that you really do know the distribution of across the different parts that make up the whole. But it also makes a lot of sense when there's a lot of uncertainty about the underlying forecasts, and you want to make sure that you're stabilizing the way things are pushed down. So in this case, what you can do in Forecast Pro is you can actually read in a definitions file, and I've already done that. And what this definitions file does is it tells you how to distribute the forecast across the different items. So I've read that in, and what I can do is instead of using the top down, I can use this custom allocation. And now it's actually using the distribution across the items that I have informed it about instead of the underlying forecast to distribute that. And during the pandemic, this can be really useful just because it means you have to worry about less, that you can worry about this level and not the forecast at this lower level, that you can put in what you expect to be happening in terms of how sales might be distributed across your different customers going forward. More questions?
Yeah, we did have one other question that came in, and then we'll see if Aiden had some during the meeting that had to do with actual folks losing customers, especially when customers were being included in their hierarchy level. So that was actually an interesting question that we had talked about internally here, because folks were saying, look, you know, we are forecasting at a customer level, we are losing customers. Now, as Sarah just mentioned, this bottom-up approach, if you were forecasting at the customer level and adding that up to your item level forecast, then obviously as the customers change, your item level forecast will change as well. But a lot of folks are forecasting at the item level. And as customers leave, they're actually seeing a drop in demand at the item level. And so there is this question of, should we be forecasting at a higher aggregate level at this point where we're doing an item forecast and pushing it down to customers? Or is it something that we're actually forecasting at a customer level and pushing it down? And so it was an interesting question that we got from folks. I think one of the big things that's important is to identify at what level of the hierarchy you're actually producing a forecast. And I think this example Sarah just showed, and this example of a question that we got before is the level at which you're forecasting, does that need to change as we're dealing with this? Because if customers are coming and going, that can affect your business, and we want to make sure that the forecast is accommodating that. So one of these hierarchical level pieces is actually a really important thing to ask about. Okay, I think we have time for one more. Aiden, do you have any additional ones that came in during the session that need to be answered?
Yeah, there were a couple that came in. One here is that Europe is kind of feeling the second wave of COVID right now, and how can you prepare forecasts, with this second wave coming?
Right, so that's excellent, and that's really sort of this middle question that we keep getting, which is their roller coaster is going to be different because there will have been a delay. So if they will have had this kind of spike, they thought they're at their normal, and now it's coming back. The key question would be can we just say it's going to be like last time, and thus do sort of the event modeling similar to what I was doing, which is we're just going to say we will have this lockdown for this period. It will look like the lockdown that we had in March, and then it will return and restore this way, so we can actually leverage that. Or would we use something more similar to what Sarah had done, which would be this basically this kind of scenario building, where we think it's actually going to be like last time, but 20% worse or 20% less impactful. And we could build those scenarios into it. So again, it will require a lot more judgment, because at that point, again, you're getting into this beginning problem again, which is that something new is happening. Do we think it's going to behave like something we've seen? We can now leverage what we've seen up until this point, or do we think it will be different? And do we need to build a scenario where if it's 20% worse or 20% less impactful, is that something we can take into account? And again, that's where your judgment will come into play and be very, very important. Okay. All right, good. Any other questions, Aiden? We may have time for one last question, and then we will wrap up for today.
Yeah, so this one is a little similar, but this one is about, people, so this is specific to healthcare, but I think this is relevant to everyone. So they say we are recovering from the pandemic, but how will this be weighted for 2021?
So that's a good question. As I said, with my examples, we were sort of saying that we have started establishing ourselves going forward. And if we have data, especially, if we have now August and September, and then potentially October, where they're starting to see a recovery, basically what the models will tend to do, especially if you event or mark as special the 5 previous periods, it is going to put a much more high emphasis on the recent data, and they need to be aware of that. And so a lot of what you'll be seeing with the expert selection tools and the models will be weighting the more recent more heavily, and will basically be favoring the new normal scenario, that if you have a few periods that are in here. And so they will basically continue that not just for 2020, but also into 2021. And that was kind of the big thing that I kept emphasizing is, how do we get through this year, and then what's going to happen? Well, the models are just going to keep going in that direction. And so there is a question of, do we think there will be some sort of shift in 2021, or are we just going to focus more on the short-term planning for now? And that's how it'll go.
The other thing that just to add to that a little bit is, one thing that we haven't talked a lot about is going into this pandemic. If you have a seasonal product, you want to make sure that you're using as much pre-pandemic data as possible, so you understand what the patterns were before the pandemic came on. The more data that you can use that's pre-pandemic, the easier it's going to be to come up with a stable model, and the less influence that some of those kind of big dips and spikes are going to have, even if you are kind of spiking them out or using events. So another good way of making sure that you can get to a stable forecast is using more pre-pandemic data as well.
Okay, good. I think we have just reached over our hour limit. So thank you, everybody, for participating. If you did ask a question and we didn't answer it, we will try to follow up with email. Aiden or Sarah or myself will follow up as well. Again, the video will be posted in the next few days, and everybody will get a link for it. So thank you again. Sarah, any final words?
Yep, just thank you very much. Hope it was useful.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Okay, bye now.